Welcome back to MadeToBeWhole. Stay tuned for our discussion on how we can use epigenetics to understand the epidemic of chronic disease.
MadeToBeWhole is intended for informational purposes only. It's not intended to replace the advice or care of a licensed healthcare professional. Participating in this podcast does not constitute a provider-patient relationship with Krista Michener, AHP Integrative Health, or any of the guests featured on MadeToBeWhole. Krista Michener, AHP Integrative Health, and any featured guests aren't responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from use of information obtained in this podcast or associated materials. Please consult a healthcare professional for any health-related concerns that you are experiencing.
Welcome back to the podcast. This is actually episode 99, so you should mark your calendars for next week, which is our exciting 100th episode. I have some fun extra things on there. What I wanted to talk about today, though, is the role of epigenetics in understanding chronic disease and the epidemic of chronic disease in our country, in our communities, in our world. So first of all, what are epigenetics? Genetics are fixed. Your genes are what they are. You're born with your genes. They cannot be changed, even though there are some weird gene therapy splicing things going on for rare diseases. But that's a whole different discussion than our realm here. So epigenetics, though, is our ability to affect genetic expression. So our genes may make us vulnerable to certain things, but whether or not those things express themselves or become a big issue has to do with a lot of other stuff, some of which we have control over, some of which we have less control over, and a lot of it has to do with our environment. I think most people without much of a background can understand that there is a lot more chronic disease than they used to. One argument I get a little weary of is, we're just diagnosing it more. There's not really more autism. We're just diagnosing it more. There's not really more name your chronic disease. We're just diagnosing it more. And I would just say that if you talk to anyone who's been alive more than 40 or 50 years, you would gather a large amount of evidence of people telling you things now that are different than when I was growing up. I knew very, very few people, very, very few children, especially with autism, with allergies, with asthma, with any number of things, thyroid disease, diabetes, just go down the list. Certainly the epidemic of mental illness has escalated. And it's not because there were lots of children being hidden in closets and not sent to school and we just didn't know about it. It was really, really unusual. I can remember the name of the girl in my elementary school who had asthma because she had an inhaler. I remember the very few people know I had allergies. I'm from a large family. I have a large extended family. I've been around a lot of people and other families. I did not know nearly the number of people who had a child with a chronic disabling illness as I do now. So it's not just that our diagnostics have changed. It's just there's just more of it. So if that's the case, what do we do to those who yell and scream that there can't be any environmental causes of autism because autism is genetic? So this isn't really specifically about autism. I'm just using that as a bit of an explanation, because if they were correct and it was genetic, why are we having more and more and more people with autism? Is it because people with autism are living longer and reproducing more? Maybe there's some element of that, but I think it's much, much more profound than that. And there's also not, I'll step back, like an autism gene. You either have this gene or you don't. That doesn't exist. But there are a group of genes that have been associated with autism. And as we look at them, we can see how environment and the time that we live in now can trigger or unleash those genes to express themselves in ways that could cause developmental delays and some of the other things that go along with autism. So one of them, I will just throw a few examples out here. There's the CACNA1C gene. It's the calcium voltage gated channel subunit 1C. So people who have that gene have overactive calcium signaling. Calcium, really, really affects muscle activity, nerve activity. It's very involved in a lot of different things. It's not just for bones. So because you've got this excessive calcium signaling, the brain's affected, and you can have neurological manifestations of that. So people who have this gene are more likely to have a harder time recognizing facial emotions. They're more prone to depression and other mood disorders, including a schizophrenia diagnosis or a bipolar diagnosis. And one thing that we know about it now that nobody would have known about 50 or 100 or 200 years ago, because it wasn't part of life, is EMFs. So EMF exposure, which has to do with living in this cool connected world that we're in, where people are always on their phones or their computers, and you've got cell towers and Wi-Fi. So you have EMF exposure. So EMF exposure is much, much more detrimental to someone who has this particular gene. And EMF exposure by itself can cause, in some people, depression, stress, anxiety, sleep issues. But if you have this gene, you're going to be much more vulnerable to those adverse effects. So a gene that has been associated with some of the symptoms of autism, some of these social delays, but whether or not it's triggered depends partly on the input that the individual is getting. It was not a problem for someone who had this gene 50 or 100 years ago to be exposed to EMFs because there was no Wi-Fi, there were no cell towers. That wasn't an issue. So if we take that as an example, what else is different in our environment now than in the past that could lead to this uptick in chronic disease, but has to do with genes? I've talked before on the show about detoxification and how genomic testing, which is helping us understand an individual's epigenetics, how it can look at detoxification pathways and help us to understand which detox pathways may be impaired in certain individuals. So one of those has to do with our body's ability to detoxify from benzenes. Probably my favorite example. If you listen to the show, you've heard it before, you get to hear it again. But if you have one copy of this genetic variant, you have 65% reduced ability to detoxify from benzenes. And so that's pretty significant. But if you have two copies, then you have over 90% decreased ability to detoxify from benzenes. So again, benzenes are problematic. They can cause acute and chronic illness, but we have much higher levels of exposure for various reasons. So some of those just have to do with where we live. Benzene exposure, unless you're someone who's working at an airport or a gas station or in a shop or someplace where there's like high levels of occupational exposure, for the regular everyday person, it's going to be in our houses, which are really, really tight and insulated these days, which is super, super great. But you have benzenes if you have a gas stove, which everybody wants a gas stove now. You're going to have more benzene exposure. And for people who can't detoxify, it's going to be a problem. You've got that gas fireplace. You have your attached garage because you don't want to have to go outside and scrape your car. You turn on that car in the attached garage, you're still going to get some fumes coming in through the door from your garage into your home. And for the person who can't detoxify, that's going to be a bigger deal. There are, in those detoxification pathways, vulnerabilities as far as detoxing from heavy metals and heavy metal exposure. We have much higher levels of exposure than we used to, and a lot of that comes in the form of vaccines, especially childhood vaccinations. So one of the driving factors between vaccine-associated injury or illness is not always the actual vaccination, but it's what they're using to deliver. It used to be that most of them, there was mercury. That was removed, but they replaced it with aluminum. So you've got this aluminum adjuvant, and you have children who before the age of 18, if they get all of the vaccines on the schedule, are going to have had the equivalent of over 70 vaccines. And that's because some vaccines are a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 in one. So it may not be that number of pokes, but it could be that one vaccine was 4 different ones packaged together. So you have not just more exposure, but you have more exposure early in life, and then these higher cumulative levels of exposure. We have pesticides, which, in fairness, some of these advances were not just for profit. It was to help protect crops and to feed people. But they are so ubiquitous in our food supply now that we're being exposed on an ongoing basis. And we have these small ongoing accumulations of things that eventually there's just a tipping point. So when you're looking at your genes and your environment and the things that you want to avoid, I think the good testing that I talk about a lot is really, really helpful, because it helps you know where to start. Because honestly, a person could become really, really paranoid and overwhelmed because there's so much toxicity in our world, which is true. But you can't live that way. But on the other hand, you could say, there's so much going on, there's nothing I can do about it. You're setting yourself up for failure. So this isn't just about autism, other things that there's been a huge rise in. If you think of neurodegenerative diseases like dementias, ALS, MS, those sorts of things. Certainly with dementia, there are huge genetic risk factors, and there's not one gene, there's not one Alzheimer's gene, there's a bunch of different ones. But knowing, oh, grandma had Alzheimer's, don't just hope and pray you don't get it. Say, what made her vulnerable, and what could I do differently to reduce my risk, or at least reduce the severity of anything that does come to pass. When you look also at allergens, so one of the reasons, and we don't understand everything. Anyone who tells you they understand everything is a liar, because nobody understands everything. But we do know that there are much higher level of allergies now than there were 50 years ago, 100 years ago, that sort of thing. And we are seeing evidence that vaccination is associated with higher levels of asthma and allergies. And it makes sense when you think of the fact that when you are using a vaccine in a young child, and we'll assume best intentions for the people who are making and giving these, I don't know that everybody has them, but we'll just assume that somebody is just so concerned about another measles outbreak that they want every child to have that measles vaccine. And that is a worthy goal. However, if the cumulative effect of measles, mumps, rubella, hepatitis, varicella, all of these vaccinations is this repeated manipulation of the immune system, the immune system starts to kind of misfire, and then you're more likely to have allergic reactions to things. That's an immunological reaction. You're also more likely to develop autoimmunity. There are much higher levels of autoimmunity in all of its forms these days, and I think it would not be irresponsible to say that vaccination could have played a role in that. A lot of stuff in our air that we breathe that we don't have control over. But again, good tests help you understand your risks and make better decisions. And it's better decisions about where to live, which things to spend your money on, as far as we're trying to buy healthy food, which obviously healthy eating is expensive. You were trying to have a clean environment. Like, where do you focus your resources? Because I don't know anyone in my personal circle with endless resources. So that kind of helps you know where to go. I'm going next week to the annual Intellex DNA conference, and always remember one of the speakers talking about infertility and how through addressing genomics, they were able to reverse that. And at the last conference, they were having their second child. One of the main things that they realized was that this person had impaired detoxification from benzenes, other gases, that sort of thing. And she was working at an airport. So she had that ongoing exposure on a regular basis. Now, certainly, I don't think everybody should quit their job at an airport. I'm really glad that we have airports and people work at airports. But for this particular individual, she needed to find a different line of work or different location because it was something that she was not genetically programmed to handle well. And so some of the fixes based on genomics that led to fertility were getting out of that environment, using low dose naltrexone, which affects autoimmunity and inflammation. It wasn't a lot of exciting, amazing things, but it was finding ways to reduce the toxic burden, reduce inflammation, and help the immune system behave in a more responsible way, I guess you could say. So with understanding and being able to map the human genome, one of the things I like to remember is even though we've been able to identify these genes and we are learning quite a bit, there's so much that we don't know because we're still learning. We're not God, we're still learning. Don't, again, get sucked into people who have all the answers because they don't exist. But some of the things that we have been able to associate with genes that can be addressed, again, we're not changing the gene, we're changing the genetic expression, are, and I'm going to go through some of them. We talked obviously about autism spectrum disorders, other neurodevelopmental issues. Along with that, encephalitis, PANS, PANDAS. I've mentioned before, I don't love the phrase PANS, PANDAS because it's just PEDS is what that P stands for and can affect adults, but there are some people that are more vulnerable to it. And with certain genes, they need to be much, much more aggressive, treating infections early, avoiding getting sick, and treating any bacterial infection early and appropriately with antibiotics, because it's much better to jump on a course of amoxicillin or whatever and treat your strep throat or your UTI and prevent a flare that could be much more extensive and damaging. So again, knowing that ahead of time can help. So some of the other things that we can learn this way are about anesthesia and whether or not your body can handle anesthesia, about the health of your brain. So we talked about dementia, but also just cognition and memory in general and trying to maintain that healthy environment. We talked about detoxification, but also hormone pathways. Everybody has hormones, everybody has sex hormones, but sometimes there's genetic variations that affect our body's ability to process, absorb, use appropriately, that sort of thing. Inflammation and runaway inflammatory pathways, what makes someone prone to struggling with their weight despite making really good decisions and someone else not at all. Even sometimes in the same family, a lot of that is how the dice rolled as far as genes go. We can learn about your thyroid and if thyroid conversion is happening properly. We can learn about your ability to absorb nutrients. Some of the nutrients I look at are B vitamins, including B12, B6, B1, vitamin D, so many different things, magnesium, copper, zinc, things that are really, really critical for all of your body's processes. We can learn about clotting, and if you're vulnerable to clotting, the way our medical system is now, we wait to test for these things after someone's had a life-threatening event or some sort of trauma. If you find out ahead of time, you're going to save a lot of money because you're not going to end up in the ER with a clot. You're not going to have a hospitalization because you got a pulmonary embolus because you knew ahead of time your risk and you were taking steps to address it. We learn about risk factors for type 2 diabetes. Yes, type 1 diabetes was what was traditionally considered inherited, but type 2 diabetes has a lot of contributing genetic risk factors that can be addressed. In the world of chronic disease, you hear a lot about MCAS and kind of histamine overload. So you can learn, hey, am I somebody who's more vulnerable to this? What can I do ahead of time? We learn about cancer risk, osteoporosis risk, whether or not you're going to tolerate certain medications, just kind of on and on and on. I was talking to my friend before recording, and my opinion of this test has evolved from when I first learned about it, thinking, oh, it's an important kind of luxury to, this is one of the best things we could do for everyone's health and could save so much money. Just save so much money. We always tell new parents, oh, they don't come with a manual. I wish they came with a manual. Well, I still don't have one that can unfold every bit of every child's personality and quirks, because people have spirits and free wills. But in a sense, if you were to do this test on your child, you would have a bit of a manual on what to do, what to prioritize with their health, to understand why illness affects them a certain way, to understand why they have trouble waking up in the morning because they overproduce melatonin, or another kid may underproduce it, we know, based on genes, and that's why they can't sleep. Just so many things that we could anticipate, prevent, and then when bad stuff happens, because it's still going to, we've got this guide to say, hey, where do we start? What's the best chance to fast track this child to recovery and to health? So in Telex, I'll do a post-conference wrap-up after I go to this upcoming conference. I look forward to sharing that. But I would just, again, encourage you to not be afraid to invest in your health and in your future. It's the best money that you'll spend. And I truly, truly believe, even if money is all that matters, you will save much more money and spend much less money in the long run by being preventative and proactive and prioritizing you. Remember to have hope, because you were made to be whole, and tune in next week for our special 100th episode.
Have a podcast question or suggestion? Text or call us on the podcast info line at 330-439-0686. Thank you for spending time with me today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to be notified when new episodes release. And remember, you were made to be whole.